All right, we're going to continue on with our lesson this evening on our series, Wrestling with the Thoughts. And again, we're talking specifically about anxiety and fear. We defined those this morning, and we talked about the professional recommendations. You know what the doctors out there in the world have to say. So tonight we're going to cover things that cause anxiety, what the Bible says about these emotions, and then how to deal with them from a biblical perspective. So that's going to be the agenda for this evening, and I'm sure we'll get through it with no problem. Just by way of quick review on just some of the high points, we talked about how fear came from the Garden of Eden when they ate of the fruit of the good and evil, tree of Eden. Yeah. Anyways, that tree. That was the first time that man became afraid, and we see it recorded, or Moses recorded for us, that Adam spoke and said unto God that he was afraid when he heard God approaching. So that was the first time man experienced fear, if you will. So that would give us an indication that fear is not a good thing. And then anxiety affects a sufferer both physically and mentally. So remember, it's not just a mental thing, that you can actually do damage to your body as well if you have anxiety issues. We also pointed out that if your symptoms exceeded what we talked about tonight or in this morning, that you ought to seek out professional help. You know, I'm not a professional counselor. I'm not a professional psychiatrist. So while we're going to talk about some biblical remedies, if those aren't helping you, there are professionals out there that can provide further assistance. We also said that anxiety is the fear of something, just reminding you of how we define that. And then we talked about fear is that we're afraid that something is going to happen. So anxiety is it might happen. Fear is that it's going to happen. And again, of course, with that being said, anxiety always comes first. So if you want to know a precursor to fear or those of those emotions, anxiety or the feeling of anxiety will be a precursor of something that you probably dread in your life. The big takeaways from here was what is obsessive. We said that the common warrior is only 55 minutes a day, whereas anyone who suffers from general anxiety disorder will worry in excess of 3 minutes a day. So if you're in this category, you probably need to seek medical attention. That's not calling anybody out. It's just looking out for your well-being or your benefit. And anxiety, again, suffers the physical and mental as well. And it could be hereditary. But remember, most professionals believe that this is a learned behavior, that they haven't found any genetic markers, even though they're looking for them. Don't use that as an Achilles heel that A, I was predisposed to anxiety disorder, or B, I learned this from my mother and father, so therefore I'm that way. If it's a learned behavior, it can be unlearned as well. So that's the big takeaway we want to remember there. Remember that 2/3 of adults who suffer from it don't seek out or receive treatment. And then with teens, if you know a young person in your life, 1 in 5 that suffer with it don't receive treatment. So there's a lot of people out there suffering that don't need to be suffering is the big takeaway there. All right. And it could be due to a chemical balance. That's why we want to seek out professional doctors, because there's a gambit of medication out there that can help you get those hormones and those chemicals correct in your brain so that your brain starts functioning correctly. We talked about how women are twice more likely to be afflicted by anxiety. Sufferers from anxiety are prone to depression as well. So if you suffer from anxiety, you could very well be a manic depressant or whatnot. And then anybody can be afflicted with this disease. But the big like I say, the big takeaway this morning was it can be managed and treated. That's what we need to remember. If we adapt the right lifestyles, we seek out the proper help, we look to God and follow His wisdom that we're going to study here tonight, it can be taken care of. Well, professionals talk about talk therapy, coping strategies, medication, and then the alternative therapies as well out there. All right. So, this is where we're going to begin anew. Things that can cause anxiety, and this is just a short list, really. It's just some things that came off the top of my head. Aging. Some people are worried about aging. Death. Now, those two we can't do anything about them. We just got to realize that's something that happens in everyday life. So, there's really not anything to be anxious about. It's just a fact of nature. However, some people are worried about loneliness. I was reading an article that the United Kingdom has actually established a minister of loneliness. This is becoming an epidemic in the world, if you will. As you know, probably, or you hear in the news, the more liberal mindset is not to get married, to have a good career, and not to have children until later on in life. Well, I think people are finding out if they wait later in life, they become unbarren and they're unable to have children, or they get mannerisms and don't want to be with anybody. And so what happens is these people retiring, and they're lonely, and it's bringing great anxiety upon them. So just be aware that it's become such an epidemic over in Europe that they've actually established an office to study this phenomenon. Some people have anxiety over money, failure. Some people can't stand the idea of failing someone or failing themselves. The future. Some people fret over what's coming tomorrow. Disasters, natural disasters. People stay glued to the TV, or they hear that a hurricane's coming, or a tornado could be imminent. They think it's going to happen to them. And war or terrorism. If you recall, about a year and a half ago, I think it was Hawaii, somebody accidentally hit the alarm for the nuclear weapons incoming. People just freaked out and went insane, and thought their lives were ending. And that's big time anxiety. I'm not saying we shouldn't be afraid. And again, the Bible doesn't say don't be afraid. It says don't fear. And so, I think in the Christian mindset, if those things are going to happen, we realize there's nothing we can do anyhow. So if we live the rightful life, we're ready to meet our Maker. And what more could one ask for? So why would we fret over something like that? And then cancer, other than mental disease or mental dysfunctions, cancer is one of the leading causes of death or whatnot. So a lot of people out there have a lot of anxiety over cancers, and some of them are very deadly, but a majority of them nowadays are very treatable. And again, it's just we need to seek those out. But I think other than the top two, 90% of those things on those lists that you may fret over will never happen or affect you. Most people aren't, there's tornadoes that happen every day, but how many people in here ever been affected by a tornado? One. So, but yet people have a lot of anxiety over those things. So again, I don't know if there's any wisdom in taking a probability class or not, and looking at statistics. But the big, just remember, more than likely, what I'm fretting over is not going to happen anyhow, and that might be a way for you to cope with it. So now let's take this a biblical perspective. With everything we've been talking up to this point is kind of man or, the general worldview of anxiety and fear. So now let's dive into some scriptures, and if you will, let's look at the wisdom of the inspired word. I want to begin by looking at Luke 4:18. And over here in Luke, he records that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of the sight of the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed. Now, I think this is what we need. I think this is the big things out of this verse right here. He sent me to heal the brokenhearted. He wants us to be at liberty. Look how many times he mentions liberty. God doesn't want you to suffer mentally. He doesn't want you to be fearful. He doesn't want you to be consumed with the things of this world. So, I might be pulling this out of context, but I think just as he wanted those that were captive, and we can think of it today, captive with our thoughts, he wants us to be at liberty with those things. I think that's why there's a whole section dedicated to don't be anxious. Again, we read Luke 4:7 this morning. And again, within here it says, and I say to you, my friends, do not be afraid of those who kill the body, and after that have no more that they can do to you. But I will show you whom you should fear. Fear him who, after he has killed, has the power to cast you into hell. So again, a lot of people fear the things of this world, but Christ is saying, don't fear this world. Fear God. Because he's the one who has the ultimate power to decide what your ultimate fate is going to be. Is it going to be damnation, or are you going to live in eternity? But if we become consumed, again, this anxiety and fear, if we become consumed with the world, we're going to lose perspective on on where we need to be. Again, over in Luke 22:34, Christ, he made it a point to dedicate a whole paragraph to not being anxious. Matter of fact, in Luke's account, 4 times he says, don't be anxious or don't worry. 4 times, if you look through there. And over in Matthew's account, I think it's even more than that. And one time he says, one time he uses the word fear. Don't fear. So he really emphasized, again, anxiety comes first, then followed by fear. And I think that's why in here, driving this home, is he warns you 4 times not to be anxious, don't worry, and only once tells you not to be fearful. Again, because if you're not anxious to begin with, then you're not going to be fearful. So clearly, we need to live in a worry and really live a worry and fearless life. Worry-free and fearless. That's exactly what he's telling his disciples right there to do. So when we talked about earlier this morning, the common worrier frets for 55 minutes a day. The Christian's not even to fret that much. So what's the answer? I know what's the $50 million question? Okay, how do I not worry? How do I not have fear of the world? How do I do this? Well, just as what Christ said at the end of that paragraph, trust in God. That's where you have to replace this with this. And we'll get into that a little bit more. But that fear has to be replaced with a trust in God, that God will provide for you. He will take care of you. And also we can't forget that all things are made possible through His Son, Jesus Christ. So again, Christians are not to live in fear. We're going to make mistakes. That's inevitable. It's just the way it is. But we have prayer and forgiveness. 1 John 1:8-9 and John 2:1 tells us those things. It tells you you're going to make mistakes, you're going to mess up, and He says it's no big deal. That if you ask, you'll receive forgiveness. So why would we be anxious over such a thing? Unless you don't have the willpower to put those things aside. But then that's another issue. So Christ gives us 4 ways of dealing. When we look at that passage, I found 4 ways of dealing with anxiety, if you will. If you remember, I passed these out this morning. Think of this is our little illustration. Put your fingers in there, and think of that finger trap. These are your emotions. This is that fear and anxiety. When you get entangled into that, you have a tendency to what? Flee away from that. You try to pull away, and what happens? You get bound up. You can't do anything, can you? You're stuck. So how do you get out of the finger trap? You have to face those fears, right? You have to bring that trap together, and then set yourself free. And I think that's what Christ kind of was teaching. I'm not saying we put things in a little box. That's not what I'm saying. Is that you have to rationally deal with those things in your head and not let them run wild. And that's one of the secrets to dealing with anxiety. I think one of the suggestions that Christ is subtly telling us is that if we go out and look to creation, He talks about the ravens, about how the ravens, they were if everyone Psalms 47 even talks about them. They're an unclean bird. Back under the Jewish time, if they came in touch with them, they weren't allowed within the camp for so many days. I mean, the raven was, viewed as a despicable bird, but yet God looked out for them. And so God looks out for all of His creation. Then He talks about the lilies in the field, and He compares that to Solomon. Solomon, who was considered the wisest king as well as the richest king in Jewish history. He talked about, think of all, the legend of Solomon, all of his splendor, of what he would have adorned himself with all of his riches, but yet the lilies have that much more splendor because of God's creation. So I think when we feel anxiety and fear or depressed, if we go and get outside and take in God's creation, we hear of tranquility. Go out there and just look to the eye. How often do you take time out of your day to just go out and look at God's creation and look at the complexity of things and just realize, I'm just like a microbe in this big awesome universe that God created. Why am I worried about all this stuff? He's going to take care of me. He took care of all this other stuff. He takes care of the grasses of the field. I mean, that's what Christ tells you right there in those verses. So when you're feeling down or you're feeling anxious, maybe schedule a trip, go to the mountains, look at the beauty of the mountains. When you get out and when you really see the splendor of some of God's creation, it'll set your mind free. So I think that's where, perhaps that's where He was going with that. We also consider God's character. God's unique love. There's a word for God's love in the Greek. They called it agape love. Over in 1 John 4:7 and 8 it says, "Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God, and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. He who does not love does not know God, for God is love. So if God loves us, again, how much more could we want? Really, when we put it in perspective, if our Creator loves us that much, what would we be anxious about if we have a full concept and grasp and knowledge of that fact? What about that God provides all that we need? Again, that whole chapter there, or that whole section in John, is it John 12? It's Luke 12. I'm sorry, it's a typo. In Luke 12, where we took a proof text, is talking about how God provides for the animals of the world, for the grasses of the world, for the lilies of the world. God provides for all that, and He counts those for nothing. We were made after His image. We are His creation. He's the one. He didn't develop a plan of salvation for the animals of the field. He developed a plan of salvation for man and mankind. So, we need to, realize that when we're worrying about these little things in life, how much greater of a thing should we, want other than our own salvation. He also provides us wisdom to deal with life's issues. That's what James 1:5 tells us. Been reading it so many times I thought I could remember it. But then you get up before the crowd and everything goes blank. It says, if anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him. So all you have to do is ask, God, how do I deal with this problem that's causing me all this stress and all this anxiety? Pray. Ask for that wisdom to be revealed. Now, it's not going to magically deposit in your brain like putting a quarter into the gumball machine. It doesn't work like that. But if you pray and meditate upon that thing, and you pray and you start watching the things in life, I guarantee you, wisdom will come your way. All of a sudden, somebody might read a verse and a light bulb might go off in your brain and say, that's what I need to do. That's how I solve that problem. It's amazing how that wisdom comes, and James was actually right. All you have to do is ask for it. God does not allow anyone or allow any more than what we can handle. We need to remember that as well. When we get into these fixations, these stressful, or we start being anxious over these things, no temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make a way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. And that's how I got through my issues. I really just came to grasp with it, realized that I had control over nothing, and that I just needed to lay it at the feet of the Lord, and that what was going to happen was going to happen, and I was just going to have to make the best decisions with what was given to me in the future and just press on with what happened. And like I said this morning, when I came to that realization, looking at verses like this, that wisdom started flowing in, and that gorilla, that 1,000-pound gorilla got off my back, and that you talk about a big sense of relief. It was huge, but I understand up until that point it can be overwhelming. But that's where we need to, trust in Him and just follow the wisdom of the Scriptures, and I think you'll work your way through those things. We need to capture our thoughts. We don't need to let them get out of control to begin with. When dealing with things, don't start going out to left field. Don't start thinking worst case scenario. Start thinking rationally. How do I deal with this? How would God expect me to handle this? What's the wisdom of the Scriptures? That, because that's all that we're given is precepts, right? Principles to follow. So if we follow those guidelines, those principles, it takes you through every obstacle that you will find in life, I guarantee you. You have control over your mind. So you are the only one that's going to be able to make this happen ultimately. People can help you along the way, but ultimately it's going to be up to you. Again, consider that finger trap. Nobody can get you out of that except for yourself. So, you inside your mind, when you're trying to fight and tear away from those awful sensations that you don't want to deal with, that you're trying to ignore and hope that they go away, realize they're not going. All they're going to do is fester more and get bigger and bigger. You have to come and you have to, think of it as crumbling up a piece of paper. All those life issues, and the smaller and smaller that ball gets, the smaller it gets. The more you realize that little thing can't hurt me. But when it's a great, big, huge, massive single piece of paper that looks like it's going to encompass you, it can be overwhelming. But if you can deal within your mind and get it all shriveled up into just a little piece, you realize that you don't have nothing to worry about. And we need to remember that garbage in is garbage out. And what do I mean by that? Well, what do you spend your time doing on your free time? Do you spend it reading the Scriptures, trying to find that wisdom? Or do you watch murder, crime shows, even movies filled with evil and violence, or people dealing with horrific issues? And I would even caution you to be careful with the news. Today's news is not really news. It's propaganda. It depends on which side, on what channel you're watching, depends on, which side's spewing what propaganda. Maybe not so much with the local news. Local news is more of what's happening in your local area. But as far as the national news, it's just about all propaganda. So if you watch that, you might be worse off. But my point is, if this is what we're filling our mind with, you got to kind of expect to have problems in life. Because what you're watching, you're going to see how Sally Sue over here handled dealing with being robbed in the back street of the alley where she works at. So now you're going to be thinking, when I go out after work, somebody's going to be out there looking for me, getting ready to capture me. And that's when that hysteria starts to set in. Well, I need to start parking over here. Well, could you walk? It just can start consuming your life. And what you realize, if you look, every sheriff's office usually has a blotter that talks about what the percentage of local crimes and stuff. And when you look them up, you realize it's minuscule for the most part. Often we don't have anything to worry about. But a lot of this will cause your mind to go places that it shouldn't be going. But if you saturate it with this, I guarantee you, you're not going to have half the problems as if it was saturated with that. Towards the end of there, Christ tells us that we need to basically keep an eternal perspective of life. That's what he says there in verse 31. Seek the kingdom first. Again, we need to prioritize things in our life. And we got to realize that, all this stuff, we often say this is just peripheral. We're just visitors on this earth. We're just a passing through. That's what the songs we sing. But when we walk outside this building, then we all fall apart, and then we can't deal with life issues, and then we get consumed with all this propaganda and all this, violence in the world, or, we start fearing, am I going to be able to put bread, food on the table? Are you worried that you're going to be able to eat, or are you worried about you're going to be able to maintain your level of livelihood? That's two different things. If you're worried about keeping up with the Rileys or whatnot, you probably don't have the right scriptural focus to begin with. Again, God will provide everything that you need. There are mechanisms out there to provide that food, raiment, and clothing. Those are the things that we need. Everything else is really peripheral. So our number one concern should be with our souls in serving God, serving Him in the fullest capacity, serving Him in the utmost that we can. And I think if we did that, we probably wouldn't have much time to be anxious about much of anything else. We often read that one verse over there in Matthew 10 says, Lord, many will say, Lord, Lord, here I am. And He's just going to turn and say, depart from me, I never knew ye not. Are any of you out there in that category? Sometimes I fear I might be, because I lose perspective sometimes. It happens, but that's why, we have to watch out for one another. Prayer is meditation, that talk therapy, James says to, James 5 says, pray with one another. Confess your trespasses to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. That's talk therapy. You're having a problem in life, you're having an issue, go and talk with your fellow Christian. Hey, can you help me out? How do I deal with this? Hey, I'm having a trouble with this sin, There's no humility. You shouldn't be humiliated by that. That's a glorious thing. That's what James says right here in James chapter 5, verse 16. Confess your trespasses to one another. Now, how many people actually confess your trespasses to one another? Or you just remain silent all the time? But that's what the therapist recommends, right? I mean, Christ had it right 2,000 years ago. We just have to follow His plan. We need to seek that wisdom. Like I say, I can't browbeat that enough. So ultimately, these burdens, these gorillas that we carry around with us in life, we just need to cast them on the Lord, and He shall sustain us. We say that it's inspired text. We say it's irrefutable. We say that it's given by the Holy Spirit. So why don't we believe it? Why don't we live it? First Peter 5:7 says, "Cast all your care upon Him, for He cares for you." I mean, that's what I think. That's what Peter was talking about. All these anxiety things, all these burdens that you're facing in life, just go to prayer. Cast those things upon. Talk them over with the Lord in your head. Even Paul says, "Be anxious for nothing, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Jesus Christ." I mean, right there it is. There's your anxiety get well plan right there. I know it's easy to say, it's easy in words, it's hard in application. But that's why we have a congregation. It's not for everyone to go out there on their own and do this. It's for us to help one another get through all this. So begin today. Train your brain. Train it not to be anxious. Train it not to be fearful. Train it to be faithful with the Lord, to trust in Him, to be wise in the Spirit, believe in God, trust in Him, and just as Mark 16:16, he who believes and is baptized will be saved. So we need to believe in Christ. What more does one need? I don't think I need anything more than this and this. That's ultimately, that's all we need. It's real. I really think it's just that easy. Romans 5:18 says we've been given the free gift of salvation. It's just here. It's just waiting for us, to partake of it. It's sitting there. It's free. It don't cost you anything. Just your dedication and devotion to the Lord. In closing, Hebrews 10:22 and 23 says, "Let us draw near with a true heart, not one filled with anxiety and fear, and full assurance of faith," again, that assurance of faith, "having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he has promised he who promised is faithful." God's faithful. Will you be faithful to God? All things are prepared. All things are ready. Just stand, and if you need anything, if you need prayers on behalf of the elders or whatnot, come forward. Let it be known as we stand and sing that song that's been chosen. Jesus is tenderly calling thee home, calling today, why from the